Hey everyone, Pastor Scott here. Just gearing up for our next little batch in our exploration through the biblical narrative. It's been a couple of weeks or a few weeks here since we have met, so we've had a little bit of a pause just due to different things that are happening. But we're going to have one more week here before Christmas, and then of course we'll end up pausing here for another week or two as well. But we're getting one in there. This time around, we are beginning to explore the story of Abraham and Sarah. Or as they are known initially, Abram and Sarai. We are picking up, or actually, I should say, when we left off, the last thing that we talked about was actually Noah and the flood. That leads off at the end of Genesis chapter 9. And we're going to fast forward just a couple of chapters through chapter 10 and 11, and we'll actually pick up in chapter 12. We'll look at chapter 12 and 13. Then we're going to skip over 14, and we'll pick up some of chapter 15. So that's kind of what we're going to look at this particular week. If you are reading along at home, Genesis 12, 13, and 15 are the important ones. Just a quick note about what happens in this skip, though. Chapter 10 is mostly genealogy, following Noah and his sons on down through the generations until we get to Abram. There's about 10, 11, 12 generations, depending on what part you read, but that's kind of what we see there. Chapter 11 is the story of the Tower of Babel, if you're familiar with that story. In this, all of the nations of the earth, everyone is kind of getting along well, and they're thinking pretty highly of themselves, and they think, let's build a tower that will get us all the way to God. And God's like, yeah, I don't think so. And so mixes up their language and really kind of begins to create some division within the world in terms of kingdoms and tribes and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me. And then following that, the back half of that particular chapter is then some more genealogy. So that's kind of what we're skipping over in terms of those couple of chapters. And then we pick up with Abram. Now, Abram is essentially a Bedouin, and he's the oldest son. Boy, I'm having some weird talking things here. He's the oldest son of a pretty wealthy guy named Terah. Terah is his dad. And we hear that Terah dies, and Abram essentially inherits the household. But remember that these are traveling people. They live in tents. They move around. And we'll hear actually later, there's this little thing. We begin to get an idea of the size of Abram's household, which is maybe not quite this big initially, but it's very, very, very large later on in the story. I think that's somewhere in chapter 14 that there's this hint that he goes out to do battle. And he takes like 300 some fighters with him that are just men from his household. So his household gets really, really big. But basically, he's this guy. We don't know why God picks him, but following in our trend of God choosing the unexpected person, that kind of continues again. So God appears to Abram, and the very first thing we hear is God's promise to Abram that he is going to bless him, and through him all of the world will be blessed. And with that, he also says, I want you to go to the land that I will show you. I'll tell you when you get there. And that's it. And Abram's like, okay. So he takes his household. He takes Sarai, his wife. Also, we hear about his nephew Lot, who comes along as well. And they begin to wander. Chapter 12 is kind of an intro to that. We begin to hear some of these things. And initially, they will travel through the land of Canaan, which is kind of, I can almost think, is the throwback to Noah and the flood. The third son of Noah, who is Canaan, is the one who is cursed, and we hear will serve his brothers. And yet this is the land that eventually the promised people will inherit. So that's kind of what God is talking about. Now, one of the other things that we hear about in this initial part is Abram goes off to Egypt because there's a famine, and while he's there, he anticipates that there will be issues because his wife Sarai is very beautiful. So he tells everyone that she's his sister, which is both accurate and not accurate. He leaves out that she's his wife. He is Abram's half sister. So he's not lying in that, but he's not telling the whole truth. And because of her great beauty, Pharaoh like wants to take her as his wife. And Abram is like showered with gifts, and he does very well. He becomes very wealthy because of this. But then things go sour, and Pharaoh's like, "Dude, what are you doing? Why didn't you say she was your wife?" And sends them out. But Abram profits from this. Now, this is actually one of two times that Abram will do this. He does it again later on. The exact same thing, and benefits from it again. So he's kind of a shifty character. He's not the nicest guy. And even though he's the one that God uses, even though his belief is credited as righteousness when he believes the promises of God, he's got his issues, which we'll continue to see. Now, we kind of skip over parts of chapter 13 and 14. In a lot of ways, they're really kind of Lot's story, what happens to him, because at one point they're both doing so well that they separate and they go different directions, and Lot kind of goes through some craziness. So we hear about that, but we're going to skip over that. You can read it if you want to, but we're not really going to focus in on that. And we'll pick back up again in chapter 15. Now, in chapter 15, we hear once again, some time has passed. I think it's about 10 years, if memory serves me correctly, from the first time that God appeared to Abram and's like, "Hey, I'm going to bless you." And Abram's kind of like, "Hey, remember that whole blessing thing that you talked about? Yeah, I don't have any kids. So what are we going to do with that?" And God reiterates the promises again. And then we begin to see another covenant, that happens. And there's a tradition that goes on with cutting carcasses of animals in two and passing a torch down through it. And we'll hear about that. We'll actually talk about that a little bit or I anticipate talking about that in our conversation. So it's God reiterating the promise again to Abram. And his name hasn't been changed yet. And really telling him what's to come. You will have descendants, and they will become a great nation. They will go into slavery, which if you know and familiar, that's the slavery in Egypt that is coming a few generations down the road. So all of that is coming, and God talks about this. So that's where kind of we're going to cover in conversation this week. Look for the questions. I'll put those out. And then in the next go around, we'll begin to look at when the descendants actually begin to come for Abram and Sarah. So looking forward to our conversation, and we will talk to you later.